What do we see? By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat. We also wept when we remembered Zion. Zion here is Jerusalem. So you have a group of Judean captives sit by the riverside, somewhere in Babylonia, and they have a sense that singing praises to their national deity requires being physically in the temple or physically in the land of Canaan. Mr. Adrian, I agree with you. It sounds like Black history, 100%, because it's talking about Black history. So just picture them. Let me pause to say this. Most of you, majority of you listening to me can relate to this exile than I can, I would admit. A group of Judean captives sitting by the riverside, somewhere in Babylonia, and they have a sense that singing praises to their national deity requires being physically in the temple in Jerusalem or in the land of Canaan. So it goes to confirm what we've studied before. A deity was tied to land. The deity was tied to the land that it was given, or the land or the territory it was given over. Verses 2. On willows in its midst we hang our harps. For there our captors asked us for words of song, and our tormentors asked of us mirth. Sing for us of the song of Zion. How shall we sing the song of Yud He Vav He on foreign land? How shall we sing? We cannot. The deity was tied to the land. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to my palate. If I do not remember you, look at these two words. If I forget, if I do not remember you, that is Jerusalem, where I come from. If I do not bring up Jerusalem at the beginning of my joy. So we find here a crucial role for memory. In the midst of national crisis, in the aftermath of tremendous loss, loss of homeland, loss of loved ones, loss of temple, and loss of the access to one's deity, the people vowed to remember where they had come from, their origins, and in so doing, remember who they were. You have to remember. If you don't remember, you disappear in history. What do you do to remember? What do you do to survive? What do you do for preservation? After a call to remember, the psalm shifts from lament to a call for revenge. Remember, O Yud He Vav He, for the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, those who say, raise it, down to its foundation. What did Edom do wrong?
They refused to let us pass through the land.
Okay. With the distraction of Jerusalem.
will help in Babylon.
Rabbi, they actually sacked the temple, and there's a it's believed that the Edomites sacked the temple.
Yes. So we see in the book of Lamentations, chapters 1, let's read from verses 8. Jerusalem sinned. So what you see on the screen is my commentary on the book of Lamentations. Jerusalem sinned grievously. Therefore, she became a wanderer. All who honored her despised her, for they have seen her shame. Moreover, she herself sighed and turned away. And I go and I explain. In verses 8, we notice that she has become a wanderer. Compare this to how she is introduced at the beginning as a widow, an aguna. We may well ask, which is better? Is it a wanderer or a widow? At least the wanderer's husband is present and accounted for, even though the couple may be separated for a while. The mourner now picks up the image of a wanderer and says that all of those who used to honor her are now degrading her because they have seen her nakedness, her vulnerability. This is reminiscent of what the sons of Edom said when they entered into the destruction. So this is what the sons of Edom were saying. Raise it, pull it down, raise it, down to its foundation. Okay. So that is what Edom, according to the text, they did wrong. Verse 21 in chapter 4. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, who dwells in the land of Uz. Upon you also shall the cup pass. You shall become drunk and vomit. Verse 22. The ones I've highlighted. O daughter of Edom, he shall punish. He will reveal your sins. So Jeremiah ends the verse with this thought. Your time is coming, O daughter of Edom. This is a call for vengeance. Which happens when you sit in exile. Which happens when you find out, how did I get here? Who brought me here? What did we do? So we shift from remember to a call of vengeance. So you have two sides. Calling on the human beings, the people, to remember where they're coming from, and then calling on the deity to remember. So you have two sides. To remember those who caused them harm, those who rejoiced when they were being taken away, when Jerusalem was being plundered. But what is critical is that both sides of the psalm emphasize memory. The Judeans call on themselves to remember their homeland, their capital city. A memory infused with longing and conviction to endure. We have to endure. Number two, the Judeans call on their deity to remember who wronged us. Babylonia and Edom. This is the context in which the Bible began to take shape. As a historical narrative, a sacred memory of a conquered people, and ultimately a canon of scripture. This is how it began to take shape. Look at verses 7 here. Jerusalem recalls the days of her poverty and her miseries, and all her precious things that were from the days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the adversary. and there was none to help her. The enemies gazed, gloating on her desolation. In the context of tremendous loss, there is a call to remember. What do you remember? You remember what has been lost. And the remembrance is going to be done through an exilic filter. Don't forget that. The remembrance is going to be done not through the filter of freedom, where you're sitting in your home with your feet crossed, drinking your tea, and you're writing. That is not a filter that is going to be written through. Is written through the filter of an exilic life, an exilic filter. Now you're sitting in exile. And the exile poses questions. The crisis of exile posed questions to the Judeans. How shall we sing the song of Yud He Vav He on foreign soil? Meaning that how can we preserve a sense of identity in our children while we are in a foreign land? How can one achieve that? Now shift your lens to, let me pause. Who is more vulnerable in this context of exile?
The children. The children.
The children. What are some of the questions that the children would ask?
If Yud Vav He is so powerful, why are we here in Babylon? Why didn't he protect us to keep us in our land?
Okay, awesome. Any other questions that you think the next generation would ask?
When are we getting out of here?
I think the questions would be predicated upon the various ages. So the younger the children, the more simple the questions, like where's my friends, or where's my cousin, or something like that. And as the kids get older, I think maybe the older children would ask a question more like what Jason said, or whoever it was that said something about the deity. So I think the questions will be predicated on their ages.
Yeah, is he real, or has he abandoned us?
Awesome.
I think that the questions.
Right, and how long? Children are going to want to know how long. How long do we have to stay here, Mom? When are you getting us out of here? How did we get here?
I think it's similar to some of the questions that I have today. Well, I'm not a kid, but just, being new to this, I'm like, well, are we supposed to go back home, or is America home now? So I'm assuming they might have questions like that. Are we going back? Should we go back? If we go back, what are we going back to? It's like things like that.
Bye-bye.
Where is our reward?
Where's what?
We stand. What is our reward? We stand in really strong and monotheism.
Correct.
We did an excellent job right there. What do you say to us today? Yeah.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Well, I think the whole thing is it said also remember. So when you're remembering, that means you got to, get back to the things that your forefathers, not the sins that they did that put you in the position in the first place, but the righteous following of your deity's laws, because that's what got us in this whole position in the beginning, because we stopped following the laws that he put forth. And by us remembering that we need to follow these laws because we're suffering the consequences of those actions of not following the laws.
We lost.
Okay,
we lost.
Yeah, Mr. Darland, very good point. Can you prove what you just said? So, before you answer, remember, your child is asking you this question. How did we get here?
Asking how we can preserve.
And you have to be able to answer your child so that your child would understand objectively. Would your child buy the idea that we did not keep the laws and commandments of our deity? That is why we are here.
Yeah, I mean, I think answering the question that you asked has to do with putting those children in their cultural context at the time that they were taken and what the prevailing beliefs were at the time, right? So you're going to be taken into Babylon. They're going to have to ask questions about Marduk at the time, and their families are going to have to address what happened with regard to Marduk and what happened with regard to Yahweh and come up with an answer, which we see in the second chapter of Lamentations. So it's, the question the children are going to be asking will have inevitably to do with what their thoughts on the deities were at the time that they were taken, not so much about the law or sin.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yes, Madam Alita, go. Mr. Vincent, Mr. Jason, and then the next person. So please go ahead, Madam Alita.
I think the question that you're asking about the children aren't concerned with all of that detail that we're giving, and they're all, the answers are adult answers. But when we talk to our children, we want to give them hope. We want to simplify it down to the lowest common denominator, and then tell them at some point things are going to be greater later. Now, we don't ever have a timeline or when it's going to happen, but what we try to instill in them mostly is just hope. Keep hope alive. Let's just keep believing that we're going to get out of here. And that's the segue to the answers that we can't give. There really is no answer that they could give them, even though the children would continually question. But all we can pacify them with is just enough hope to get by. That's all we could do. We couldn't give them any concrete answers. There was nothing that could soothe them. They're children, first of all, and secondly, our adult answers are meaningless to children. So that's why we would have to break it down as low as we could and give them as much hope as possible.
Okay. Hold on. So we lie to our kids all the time when they little though. Y'all really just brushing over that, right? Because we lie to them constantly. Tooth fairies, all of these fairy tales and all that. But my question is back to the how do you prove it to them, especially when you're a family who is kind of living righteously or upright? What do you say to them?
Very good.
Mr. Vincent, that's what my point was going to be, right? The thing is, and it's like this, just to get there quickly, right? The Torah says that if you obey your parents, right, you shall live long on the earth. And it tells us that if you obey your parents, you shall live long on the earth, right? What happens to the child that's obeying their parents and dies at 15 of cancer, right? You have these anomalies. So the thing is that when you're dealing with children, even with my children talking about the text, you have to be honest with them. There's no way to prove that all of Israel was sinning. There's no way for us to even prove that. Matter of fact, there's no way for us to even prove that they were sinning to begin with. But what I can state is that when we look at extra biblical texts, like if we look at the Moabite stele, they have the same similar thing as like we have about Babylon. In the stele, it says that Because you were sinning against Chemosh, he allowed Israel to overtake you. But now I'm here and I am doing everything that I'm supposed to do for Chemosh. Chemosh has vanquished Israel and laid Israel to waste as well. So what happens is that the people come up with these stories because it is a way for them to be able to say, okay, we were conquered because of this. When the reality was, Babylon was just a bigger group. Israel is a smaller area. Babylon had all of Assyria at the time as well, too. They're just a bigger nation. So if they come up against you, you're going to be conquered. As simple as that. Probably had nothing to do with sin at all.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion, see, our problems as adults or grown-ups or even parents, we think that children don't understand stuff. Biggest fallacy in the world, okay? They understand plenty, okay? And you do them a disservice by attempting to think you're shielding them from information that they need to know. That's the biggest flaw that we as adults have. We learn by repetition. They may not get it now or get it right then, but the repetition of the exercise, this is the process of us doing the feast days. It's a repetition. Yeah, we don't get it now, but eventually we'll get it. Okay, so we cannot just go oh, they're too young. That is the biggest malarkey in the world. That's absolving you of responsibility because you just don't know how to explain this situation properly. It's not that they won't understand it. You just don't know how to explain it yourself to them properly. And you can never get anywhere and without knowledge. Knowledge is the key, period.
So I took your question about the vulnerability of the children in a slightly different way, I think, because I think often when you have children who are either first generation or second generation from another country, the issues are normally like making sure that they still understand the language. They forget the language. They want to get rid of the accent because they want to be able to fit in. They want to do the festivals that the other children around them are doing rather than their festivals. They don't want to necessarily eat the food that is traditional to their original culture because they don't want to be different. So I was looking at it more like the children are vulnerable because of how much they normally want to fit in and assimilate. And so it would make sense to me that you'd create a really big, wonderful story about the nation and the God of the nation that kind of makes them still want to be a part of that culture and want to cling to the culture and want to teach their children about it so that the culture and the traditions aren't lost. Because I mean, in this country, you see it a lot with Asian children. I know my parents went through it. Even my grandparents, especially on my mum's side, then they were really encouraged not to speak patois, to speak English so they could get a good job and stuff like that. And so you find, or like I go to my grandparents' house and I love the traditional food. I love the yam and the sweet potato and all that stuff. But most of my cousins didn't. So if my grandma was cooking, then she would give us like just English food, like fish fingers and mashed potato. And my granddad would be sitting there eating his proper Jamaican food. And I would be so jealous. But the assumption was that we're English kids, so we would eat English food and not the food from back home. So in my mind, that was the vulnerability. And that's why I could understand the story kind of getting amped up so that the children are involved and they feel like they have something to be proud of in their heritage.
Thank you very much for the contributions. Very good point. The very good point Madam Cherie just made. I'll piggyback on that, but let me make a comment on Mr. Jason's submission. I asked the question about not keeping the laws, statutes, and commandments. The reason why the text gives, this is after the fact. Remember that. The text is given an after the fact reason for why they are sitting in Babylonia. Okay. What we should know, as Mr. Jason accurately pointed out, the other nations felt the same. When the other nations conquered other nations, they say that it was their deity who asked them to, and it was their deity who gave them victory. When they lost, when they are conquered, the reason is because they were not keeping the commandments of their national deity. So it's not only Israel that has that explanation. Across the ancient Near East, that was their belief. It's very important to know that. So, saying that it was the statutes, laws, and commandments that we were not keeping that brought us into exile, it's a nice way out. My opinion, I disagree. We could have kept all 613 commandments, statutes, laws. Babylonia was still conquer us because their army was powerful, they were more bigger, their strategy was more effective. No prayer could have saved us. So now we have to be objective when we are answering these questions.
Brother Basil?
Mr. Chris.
That begs the question of the power of the deities of the nations. When we posit that answer that they beat us because they were bigger and more powerful, I absolutely agree. But it also begs the question of what the power is of each of the nation's deities.
Correct. So when we say this nation's deity is powerful, that power is seen through what? Who knows?
It's seen through the lens
After
of the
they
people.
beat us?
Again, sorry?
It's seen through the lens of the people.
Correct. But what would determine that this deity is powerful?
They won the war, or they won their fight.
Correct. Correct.
Can I just like piggyback off that as well?
Yes.
Because you see a difference in how the narrative is written. You know, when Lot gets taken along with, I can't remember who it was, the people, and Abraham has to go and get him. And there isn't like an assumption, or that it's not written into the text that Lot was sinning wherever he was, and so that's why he got captured. It's just he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and some other people were stronger and they came, and so Abraham had to go and take action to go and get him back. That's how the narrative is written there. And so when we get to this part of the text, then you can kind of see the difference in the political propaganda of, oh, this happened because of sin and because we weren't doing this, instead of, I don't know, just kind of being a bit more realistic about it, like you had in the narrative about Lot, if that makes sense. But there's quite a big difference in how it's reported on.
Correct. Like I said, we have in the series, I'm going to show the strategy that was used by the Assyrians and then the Babylonians. You know, how they were working, what was going on within Jerusalem, Judah, you know, the debates, the strife, the internal struggles, all of that, you know. But again, they're in exile. They're in exile, and you have to make sense of why you are there. These questions are coming from the next generation. How do we fit into this world? will be one of the questions. How do we fit in? Like Madame Cherie said, who are we? Why were we conquered? What are our values? Now, how do you answer these questions?